strategic plan, and they said, it would be good to scoot up your comp class comprehensive study by 1 year. So we did, and we'll have something we can check off as completed starting in July when this is implemented, if so approved. Matrix also recommended that the council develop a pay philosophy of where you want our city to be. So Ruth Ann is going to be leading that discussion with you tonight, and hopefully we'll be able to mark off some sort of direction that you give us of what you would like that to be. By June of '07, we had bids, and we had the project budgeted, and we had a selection team in place, and a quick thank you goes out to Vice Mayor Antoniak, Councilmember Lord, and a special thank you to Dick Sousa, who served on this project not only this time, but back in 2000, 2001 when we did the original study. They did a lot of work on this. Thanks to Mark Gaylord and Brian Dalkey, who also served on that team, and Jeannie and Vicki were on that team also. It's not one of those fun, great teams to where you're picking out art or something. It's a lot of work. Also, a special thank you to Ruth Ann, who coordinated our project with Waters, and a very, very special thank you to Vicki Lackey and Jeannie Ruddy, the ladies in black in the second row, because they hung with the consultants the whole time, and they worked with everything to make sure every dot was dotted and every I was dotted and every T was crossed throughout the project. And you need to know that Jim and Brian were just phenomenal during this. You get that. People usually say, the top executives have to support a project like this, and they usually do verbally. But these men were with us the entire time, and it was not something that they really enjoyed. They spent hours and hours going over grueling details, and it was exhausting, time-consuming, but they hung in with us, and they did a great job. And I think that goes to show how much our top executives value our employees, that they were willing to put in that time and effort. And so, back when September '07, when Ruth Ann originally talked to you about the project, she reviewed market position with you then and got the indication that you wanted to be somewhere less than 106, but very competitive. Well, we've asked her to present something differently to you tonight, and I know you're aware of this, to come in at 100% of market, which is less than the direction that you guys gave us back in September. But it goes along with what our economic picture looks like right now. And staff also asked Ruth Ann to recommend a 1% market increase after the plan is implemented. And what that would do is allow everyone, all the employees, a 1% increase. And we're hopeful that will help them with cost of insurance increases and provide just that little bump during times when we don't have the merit plan in place. And let's see, you've also heard from Brian that our goal would be if economic times improve and revenue is up, we would come back to you in January and say, let's go for another 1 or 2% of market, whatever is affordable at that time. So that's the groundwork, and Ruth Ann Elledge will now take over and talk to you about the details of the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mayor and Council, I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight to present the recommendations and results of the compensation study. I'm not going to go through all the thanks that Kay did. She did such an excellent job of thanking all the folks that have worked on this. And I guess I can just say ditto. That may not be quite the professional terminology, but it was a joint effort. It was a great partnership, and I do want to thank everyone. Today, what I'd like to do is go through the project, the methodology. We talked about this a little bit when I first presented to you earlier, but as a beginning point, we'll walk again through some of the methodology, then we'll move into the results and recommendations and talk to you about any questions you may have about the proposed implementation of the plan. You have before you a notebook that looks like this that has in more detail my presentation and recommendations and findings. And gives you quite a bit of bedtime reading. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to look at all of the documentation on the project. I'm going to skip who Waters Consulting is because hopefully by now you know who we are and don't have any questions about the company. I will begin by talking again about the scope of the project. We did look at how jobs were classified here at the City of Goodyear. One of the nice things about involvement in this project is Waters Consulting did the study back in, I think it was 2001. And so being able to come back in, look at the progress the city has made over the years, the work that they had done to update the compensation system, because a lot of time and effort has been put into keeping that system up to date. It was actually a joy to work with the staff to look at where they had been, what they had done, and what needed to be done to update the overall system. And we did just that because we updated the job evaluation system, we updated the classification system, we conducted the market and benefits survey to see where you are now in relation to market, and then have brought to you proposed structures that reflect market competitive positions at market. So those are all the pieces of the project that were involved in the study. I'll remind you also of the objectives that we went into this study with, trying to make sure that we balanced our policy decisions with internal equity and external equity, being the market, being consistent with how you're currently structured because you have changed over time. Finding a system that continues to be one that can be explained to employees so they understand what this system means to them and how they're going to progress through it and how it will continue to be updated over time. And that, of course, that all-important bullet of one that is being fiscally sound, because we do want to make sure that we recognize the fact that we are stewards of tax dollars, and the recommendation should be a balance of what is affordable and what needs to be done to keep the city competitive in their ability to attract and retain employees. The deliverables of the project are listed here. The analysis of the jobs, and we have an updated classification system. We did collapse some positions. We did move some titles or change titles, and there's a new allocation list of old title versus new title that can use to track those changes. We did conduct a new updated point factors job evaluation system, the survey itself, proposed structures, and a final report which you have before you now. Again, an overview of how the project was conducted, beginning with the collection of data from employees through the job description questionnaire. Employees were asked by HR to update their current descriptions and to indicate any changes in their job duties or responsibilities since their job descriptions had previously been written. So we wanted to have current, accurate data about work that's being performed. Using that to conduct the internal evaluation and in the market study, so that we were very careful and cautious about having good matches with market data. We matched job content and job requirements with the market, not just job titles. Those two aspects of the project were then brought together to create your revised structures, and of course we'll have a few changes to the salary administration guidelines and procedures on how to continue to update your system in the future. Just very briefly about the individual phases of the project, and this is a very informal briefing, so if at any time you have any questions about our work or the recommendations or methodology, please feel free to step in any time. In the job classification phase, I mentioned earlier that we use the information updated by the employees, and we did a whole new evaluation of the relationships of positions, and that was our guiding principle on how to split jobs out that had similar titles but had different functions, and they needed to have a different title that was more relevant to the work that was being performed. And there was a few of those that we did split out jobs so that it was clear what work was being performed. We also looked at the administrative positions. Those are always a group of jobs that you want to evaluate and make sure you got those classified correctly. And so there were a few tweaks there that we did on those and some of the other jobs as well. We did look at Fair Labor Standards Act designations, those jobs that are eligible for overtime and not eligible for overtime, and made a couple of recommendations, about a handful of recommendations for changes to their exemption status, and those have been given to the Human Resources Department for implementation. And again, I mentioned that we have an allocation list of old titles and new titles. We did conduct about 104 individual or group interviews with employees too, to make sure that we were clear about the work that was being performed as an augmentation to the job questionnaires and descriptions that were provided to us from the employees. So it was a pretty thorough process for going through and classifying jobs and making sure that they're appropriately classified in titles that reflect the work that's being performed. Once we had completed the classification phase, then we moved into the job evaluation part. Point factor job evaluation is not a new concept to this organization. You have been using that system for some time. So our energies and efforts in this area were first looking at what needed to be updated to your current point factor system, confirming the weightings of factors, redefining some of the definitions, and the levels that we used in conducting the job evaluation. So now we have updated manuals that are available for use on a continued basis, so as jobs change and as new jobs are created, you can continue to use that same system to place positions into your new pay structures. We think that really does result in a fair internal review of jobs, making sure that we're consistently evaluating positions on factors using the same definition for each job, for each factor. We conducted that process on non-exempt positions because, if you'll recall, non-sworn positions, the non-sworn jobs, because if you'll recall, sworn positions already have a hierarchy. We know police and fires because of the reporting relationships in the ranks. So in essence, they were already ahead of the non-sworn positions because you understood their relationships. So we did go through this process with all the non-sworn, both exempt and non-exempt jobs, to update your two structures for those positions. And we looked again at what the job requires most of the time under normal circumstances and rated each job on each factor and used a consistent definition throughout this process. Again, these are the factors that were used. They are similar to the factors that you have used in the past, but they have been redefined so that you have more clear definitions using a new point factor system in terms of the numbering that is applied to each factor. So while the factors themselves, the titles, may look familiar, sometimes the definitions and certainly the levels within each definition have been altered or have been updated so that they more accurately reflect your organization. The process involved looking at every job for every position, taking that to a job evaluation team that helped confirm the ratings that Waters Consulting did recommend, then going to department directors, having them look at the proposed hierarchy that resulted from those ratings, giving feedback to HR and to Waters Consulting, until finally we felt comfortable that we had a good hierarchy that really reflected the organization here in Goodyear. So we feel like it's addressed the internal equity issues, and placement of jobs into the pay structure is based on that internal hierarchy that resulted as a result of the point factor system. So in essence, we have a hierarchy of jobs for exempt and for non-exempt. This is an example, but you can see that the points then can help establish the relative value of jobs, and then you can group jobs of similar value together into grades or groupings, and then bring in market data to establish the range of pay for each one of those groupings. At the same time we were conducting the job evaluation, we also conducted the pay and benefits survey. We looked at who you have previously collected data from and who you wanted to adjust in your collection of data. And we worked with you at the last council meeting to establish that list of organizations. And basically, we used this criteria for how we determined who you should collect market data from. And this is the list of organizations that we did use. We collected data from all of them. Of course, not every organization matched every job, but they all responded to the survey and provided data for those jobs that they had that matched within their organization. For the exempt and non-exempt pay data, we were using average salaries to target the midpoint of those ranges. And so we did age that data to your implementation date since the data was collected in October, and we used about a little over 2% aging factor. For the sworn positions, we targeted pay ranges, which is different. We wanted minimums of proposed ranges for sworn positions to be competitive so that you could have a good competitive hiring rate for your police and fire sworn positions. So we used two different types of data to establish your ranges: actual salaries for your exempt and non-exempt structures, and range data focusing on minimums of proposed ranges for police and fire sworn positions. When we collected the data and then began to compare it to where you currently are, the good news is that your structures really aren't off that much. They're about 1.5% market averages. The minimums in police and fire and the midpoints in the exempt and non-exempt structures. Now, what we did find is that there were some positions within those structures that were more out of market than others. And as we went back and checked the job evaluation and how positions were slotted into the ranges, we found that, sure enough, we were able to correct those jobs so that the ones that had been behind in their individual range had been moved to a range that was more competitive. So that process worked very well, and there were a few jobs that we had some market data on that we also adjusted based on the individual market data. So I think even though your current ranges were fairly competitive, we did do some adjustments so that some individual positions that had been behind market in their range have now been shifted to a range that is more competitive for their position.
Excuse me, would that be more than a 1% increase? Could that have been?
There will be some positions that just to move to minimum will get more than a 1% increase. Some of those increases.
So some will be pretty happy then.
Some will be very happy.
Thank you.
Yes. But I do want to caution employees that are listening to this that that is the exception to the rule. The vast majority of employees are going to see, probably, less increases than that, 2 to 3%. So I want to try to manage those expectations so that we don't have employees going out and buying any truck or something. So we did, after we had compared your current ranges and looked to see that you had good ranges now for all employees, we looked at in the design of your new structure, not only the placement of the positions, but also the actual design of the structures. What we found in a few minutes is you'll see that we did change the design of some of the pay structures to be more in line with how market design structures for those jobs. When Kay was speaking earlier about market policy, one of the things that we talked about at our last meeting when I was visiting with you was the relationship of your proposed structures to the market data. And when we last talked, we had indicated, or you had given me feedback, that you wanted to be in a competitive range, which was about, and we define that as about 101 to 105% of market average salaries. Unfortunately, at this time, because of some fiscal constraints, we're bringing to you pay structures that are at about 100% of market averages. What we're asking, though, is to give some confirmation or some direction about where you would like to be if fiscally you're able to get to that point. Is the 101 to 105 still where you want to be? And can we narrow it down a little bit more to 101 to 103 or 103 to 105? Or do you have any direction or any discussion that might help us in the future try to target increases when it's affordable to do that?
First, that will depend on the evaluation of the budget that we'll be confronted with within the next 2-3 months. So, or 2 months rather.
Right.
I guess she's saying if the market comes back doing quite well, where do we want to be at that point? Do we want to be at 101 or do we want to bring it 103?
I think
Or do you want to go up to 105?
we'll be competitive. We'll split the difference to 103.
103, that's what I was going to make a compromise.
You want to do 103? Add another 0 to that paycheck of yours, Gary. Yeah. I'll jump out there and say I'd like to be 101 to 105 and be there. I think it is a tough question to answer without knowing, we all say if the market rebounds, to what extent would be my question. And so, if the market rebounds 2%, are we going to go to 105? If the market rebounds 5%, are we going to go to 105? Maybe more open to that. So I think it's something that, at least from my vantage point, something that we would need to evaluate based on the circumstances that are presented, say, 6 months down the road. That said, I don't want to see us slip below market. I don't want to see us losing folks to neighboring cities or even to cities that are closer to home for some folks that travel 20 miles each way. So I think, it's a tough one to answer.
Well, and one of the reasons why I asked for this feedback is because HR can continue to monitor the market, and your fiscal situation. And if overall your preference or your goal, and of course you're not committing the council to a future place because it's always going to be within your fiscal constraints. That's a given. But if your overall goal is to be, for example, around 103% of market, then they can help bring you some plans that will show you how you could get there over time within your fiscal capabilities.
I mean, I think the 103 is a laudable and achievable number for us to sustain if we can over the long term. I don't want to see us dip below. I mean, I think 101 is nice. It's kind of like, I mean, it's not great, but at least we're edging out, our neighbor a little bit. I mean, I would.
Most of our neighbors aren't moving at all.
Yeah, a lot of them aren't going to move at all. It's true.
Not during this period of time, anyway.
Well, that's the question that's tough to answer right now. I mean, I'd like to be offered our employees 103, 105 for your help, but it's a tough one to answer.
Even when times are good, you're always going to have people above the 100% and people below the 100%. And of course, we want to get them all to 100%. That's usually the goal. I just think that if we can get them all to 100%, we've achieved a really big thing. And from a competitive point of view, offering 101, 102, it's great because you really are a competitive outfit.
Except that, weren't you at 106% at one time?
We were.
That was the max, that was the high.
That was the aggressive.
I just remember when you coming on board, that number was given out.
The aggressive approach.
Well, but, we were under everyone else. I think we were, Mark, 90% on police salaries in Phoenix, wasn't that what we did?
Yeah, that's true.
We were in the 90s.
Yeah, that was our policy in the 90s. It's changed. We're now competitive across the board, generally. I don't know why we have to answer that question right now. I think
it's a tough one.
I think we need to.
I think Kay has a reason
But,
why she wants to stay.
We have our matrix goals,
Let me
so
make this point, though. Okay, we appreciate the position that our employees have taken up to our actions up to this point. And I think that they've been favorable to go easy on us, and we should respect that position in the future.
would it be fair to you all if we were to say, based on the matrix recommendations, we came up with a council pay philosophy that we would like to be competitive compared to the market at 100% or above, depending on maybe turnover and where our employees are coming from and going to, and that we bring you back that information, and then that helps you decide for that particular year the competitive position? Something to that effect, where we've met our matrix recommendations, we've established something along the guidelines of whatever you all say, and yet we're not pinpointing you down to 102.7.
Would that also have to do, Kay, with the positions that are being made available? For example, we can say a lofty goal is to get everybody at 100%, but there's some pay grades, some positions that there are more people applying for those positions than there are others. So you'd have to come back to us and tell us what those positions are that you wanted to go to 101 or 102. Not all the grades would need to do that.
We've done that traditionally over time with giving additional percentages to the police department over years when we were behind and came to you and asked you for that. Quick recap of where we were. Back when we implemented the plan, 106% for the first year, then 106, 103, 101.7, 101.2, 101.2, 100.9. We'll be at 100, and we'll be moving back up to 101 if you all budget for this accordingly, as we are recommending. So we're staying in the neighborhood of 101. And
103 would be a good
goal.
shoot for, right?
We had a problem with turnover back in 05-06. We were up to 13.3%, and that's when we came to you and said, we have some recommendations for retention, and you all were very generous with that. It really, I think, helped. 06-07 was down to 8.52, and 07-08 we're estimating 9.24. So we're really watching our turnover. We can tell you that employees leaving us this year, 80% are going to public sector employees and 20% to private So you just have some statistics to kind of get behind these numbers. Employees that we hired, interestingly enough, 64% came from the private and 36% from public. So the cities that are in our survey are cities that we're getting from and taking from. So we're all out there for the same folks.
Well, that's why we need to be competitive with the other cities. Private market, it's just not going to happen. But with the other cities, we have to be flexible enough to be able to make those decisions quickly when we see particular departments are lacking in employees.
Nice Neo story today. We had an employee return from the private sector who left for more money and came back for other values. So we're delighted to have him back.
Okay, you brought up the question on matrix. How does the study, did the study itself meet all the questions that were, or concerns that were raised by matrix?
Yes, they want, well, with the exception of this pay philosophy, they wanted us to be sure we were internally and externally competitive, and that's what Ruth Ann is going through with you to show how she is getting us there. And then to develop a pay philosophy was a separate recommendation. And so I just don't want us to fall behind on our matrix recommendations, particularly when it's your all's goal.
I think you can, I mean, I don't think anybody disagrees with the goal of wanting to be competitive. Tying to a number is a tough, that's the tough part of the question. If there's a policy decision or a statement to be made, I would craft it along the lines of exactly that, to stay at or above market.
But it is a goal. It's not a decision.
Or maybe the policy is crafted such that, within 90 to 180 days of slipping below market, it's incumbent upon human resources and management to notify council. Maybe that's it. So then that way you've got a way to initiate that dialogue with us.
Primarily, we're going to do an annual survey, but if we see problems with recruiting, then we're going to zero in and check. So, and I think you would expect us to fix those.
Oh, and
They happened along the way.
I think that Brenda did have a good thought that there may be areas, departments that everybody's, jumping ship, and we have to get aggressive at keeping those positions. And so, I think you're yearly coming back and saying, for the most part, staying here is going to be good, but there's a couple of departments that I think we're going to need to be more aggressive with, At the end of the economic downturn, all of our financial analysts may just want to go somewhere else.
I mean, the stress has been too much.
Yeah, a couple years ago, you couldn't keep a planner.
That's right.
Today, they're probably knocking on the door.
Right.
Life changes,
That's why we have to be so flexible.
And then you've got IT people who you bring in and you teach, and they learn the job, and the more they learn, the more valuable they become, and soon they become so valuable that especially private enterprise picks them up. There's nothing you can do about that, not a thing in the world, because we can't compete with that. And that's just one of that department, that's just one of those hazards of losing personnel. And they're going to turn over. That's all there is to it. And I don't think you can do anything to stop
And I think
that.
we pride ourselves on educating our employees throughout the city,
And
so
that's
they
true,
get
we
their
do.
water certifications and they become more competitive. So we can't always be the best paid.
And that's right. And they're going to find that more competitive job because we've trained them and put them in that position. I can name several people in our IT department, and in finance, I suppose, is the same way. But those are just hazards of the situation, and there's nothing you can do about that. So I don't think any number is going to, be
Won't stop all the
No,
problems.
it won't stop that. So I think those are things you have to take into consideration.
I didn't hear anybody disagreeing with the comment you made.
So if I came up with a
You said
statement that
100% or
incorporates-
higher.
Yeah.
I didn't hear any disagreement with that.
I think we've established our pay philosophy, and we'll try to narrow it down as time goes on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there were two items that came out on a review of the competitive positions. Number one was the evaluation of the high benefit on dental, and then the other Goodyear standby pay is the highest of the survey cities. Those two I would like to discuss with you at a later date.
We will do that. In fact, Ruth Ann is not finished with her presentation yet, so I just wanted to jump in there on that pay philosophy, wanted to see if we could circle that and consider it done, and we will definitely, she has a list of things for us to consider.
Okay.
Okay, moving then on to the development of your revised structures. As we gathered the market data, looked at the hierarchy of jobs, and began to revise your structures, we, as I said earlier, used actual average salaries as the midpoint target for your non-sworn, exempt, and non-exempt positions. And of course, jobs were placed into that structure based on the internal evaluation. And we placed these structures at market. So in essence, when we plotted the market data based on the grade assignment, the regression line that is running through that market data is on average at the market salaries. We did review the number of grades that you have in your current system, and have had some minimal adjustments in the number of grades. We did keep your range spreads at 48%, which is what your current range spread is. That's the distance between the entry of the range to the maximum of the range, and that is consistent with what we saw in the market data. So here is how we designed your exempt pay structure. This is the first one is the exempt. I'll show you the non-exempt in a moment. And basically what you see is the market data plotted based on the grade that a job is assigned to. Each one of those little diamonds is average market salaries, and the regression line is the green line through the middle that establishes the midpoint of your proposed structures. And you can see that's actually a very nice regression line that fits very nicely with your pay grade assignment based on internal evaluation. So to create the range around that midpoint using the 48% spreads, you can see the blue line was created so that the green line is exactly 48% from so the red line, which is the maximum of the range, is exactly 48%, and the midpoint is the mathematical midpoint of that range spread. And that is the anatomy of a pay structure. You'll see on the next slide the same process was used to design your non-exempt structures. Again, you see a good distribution of market data within the proposed ranges, the entry, midpoint, and maximum being drawn around the market data. And so in essence, that is how your non-exempt and exempt non-sworn structures were created. So let's talk about the sworn positions, because we did use a little bit different methodology. We focused more on ranges because unlike non-sworn positions, typically sworn jobs, you want to make sure your entries are competitive and then allow them to move through the range as they move through over years of time, because police and fire usually go through their ranges and then go through their promotional processes. And so the structures are set up to have competitive ranges of pay to allow you with competitive entry rates and a pay spread that allows for movement over a period of time that encourages some police officers to stay as police officers, and then those who want to move on up to detective and sergeant, there is an incremental increase from one grade to the next. So your structures were designed in that manner, using the market minimums as the target point for your minimum of your proposed structure, and mimicking or making similar spreads of pay from that minimum on to the maximum of the range. So you will see in this structure some changes in spreads, so that some of the higher levels have a little bit more narrow spread, but their differential from the lower levels is greater, and that helps avoid some of that overlap and compression. And I think it will be a good benefit to both your police and fire departments to have those designs, those small design changes for your non-sworn police and fire positions. You can see in the next structures, or in the next graphs, now we have the market data focused on the entry of the range, which is the blue line, and you can see the market data average entries for both. This is your fire pay structure and your police pay structure. So they were designed a little bit differently from the non-sworn exempt and non-exempt structures. So those are your ranges. Let me talk just a little bit. Kay mentioned earlier some of the benefits recommendations. And the one thing I want to preface this discussion with is we are looking at trends that other organizations have. And because they're doing that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be doing it. but these are targeting areas that you should evaluate, human resources should evaluate, to see if it makes sense for you to make some adjustments based on what we found in the market in terms of best practices and pay and benefits. I will say that generally speaking, your benefits and pay practices are very competitive. There were not a lot of issues or not a lot of concerns that we saw. However, we did want to note these areas for further consideration. When you look at vacation leave accruals in other organizations, they're trending upon hire and up through the first 5 years to have about 2 more days of vacation time than you currently offer. Many, if not most of them, are starting out with 96 hours versus the 80 hours of vacation time. And so you may want to consider making some adjustments in your accrual rates beginning at entry. When you get up to the 5 to 10 year, they're pretty competitive. And then after you get to 10 years and over, again, there's some lagging there. So you may want to consider looking at the accrual rates for vacation at different groupings of time. The other thing we saw is that currently your carryover rate is a little bit less than what we saw in other organizations. You're at 240 hours carryover, and many of the organizations we surveyed are at 320. So you may feel like you want to look at your carryover rate from one year to the next. Now that can have a fiscal impact, and so you have to balance that with the decision to allow more carryover. We saw that in employee assistance programs, you have three visits to employee assistance, and most of the other organizations had 7 and more. In fact, the average number of visits was 7. Now, in your particular circumstances, after 3 visits, then they go into the health care program and don't have to switch providers. So it may not make sense for you to increase your number of visits. There is a cost savings to having those 3 visits if they don't stay within your health care program. So you may want to encourage them to continue to do that and not offer more free visits outside of that. So it's an area you may want to evaluate and determine if you think it's wise to move into more free visits outside of your health care plan. Another area that we saw was the family dental premiums on a monthly basis. Your premiums are running at $116 a month, and the average premiums that we saw in responding organizations was about $75. Now, that on the surface doesn't necessarily mean that you should reevaluate your dental offering. You may have a very rich dental plan while others may not be very rich or not have a lot of opportunity for services. So again, it's an area that HR should explore and decide if it's some place that they need to evaluate the cost and how that's provided to the city of Goodyear. We also saw that shift differential rates were a little bit higher for first shift in other organizations. Your rate is 35 cents an hour, and we saw an average of around 50 cents in other organizations. So you may want to consider changing your shift differential rate, particularly for the first shift. We also saw that your standby pay policy is very rich and tends to pay out about $1 or more an hour than other organizations. You may want to consider that. That may be an area of concern that you address through that, or you may decide you want to shift those dollars over to on-call pay. Right now, your on-call pay is a policy of 3 minimum hours, and then it's just the regular hourly rate that they get after the 3 hours. I've been hearing, or I've heard that a lot of times the on-call ends up being much longer. Then the shift is sent home and doesn't necessarily work overtime for the rest of the week. And so those extra hours they have worked in the night, they don't get any added value from. So that may or may not be an area that you want to evaluate and review.
So they just get straight pay.
After the 3 hours.
Say that again. Help me understand that. Give me a bit more real-life example of that.
If, let's say I'm a utility worker,
Right.
and I get called out for a line break or something, and I get paid 3 hours overtime, and then but I end up having to work 6 or 8 hours all night trying to repair that. Because of many reasons, none the least being safety, I may get sent home and not work my next regularly scheduled shift. So of those 8 hours that I worked through the night, 3 hours were at time and a half, and the other were at regular hours. And then I continue on with a shift later on, but don't get a total of more than 40 hours in that week. A lot of organizations do compensate more for those hours that are outside of the normal shift. So those 8 hours,
That would be if it happened on the front end, but say Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, you are on hour 39.
then they go
And you
into
work
the
8 or 10 hours.
Yeah.
in
Then
the
they go
night,
into the
you go
overtime.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's on the front end of your
Right.
week or your pay period where you may pull an 8-hour all night, and you're going to get Friday off, but you're not going to make any real benefit outside of those first 3 hours.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a policy decision if you feel like it's important to compensate them for those out-of-work shift hours.
And you're saying maybe shift that standby pay to that, what'd you call it?
Overtime.
Oh, well, it's not overtime. You're calling it shift differential.
On call.
pay.
Or callback, I should
Okay.
say, yeah, callback. Those are just some areas for review and evaluation in your policy process. Okay. Does that make sense?
Okay, it totally makes sense. I didn't realize, I'm learning here in the process too, so.
It's fun. There's all kinds of different types of callback and on-call and standby and so forth.
So standby pay is just a straight, if I remember correctly, past experience, the standby is just like a straight 1 hour, 2 hours that day you get paid to have your phone on and not be at a party on Saturday night, so you're ready and available.
You're ready to come to work.
Okay.
You're ready to come to work. Another area that we saw that might be beneficial for you to review is the firework schedules. Your current fire department or your current firework schedules work a 14-day, 2756-hour schedule. When we surveyed other organizations, they had a longer work period, a 28-day schedule with 29 12-hours. That helps distribute work and could help cut down on overtime. And so you may want to explore an opportunity to move to a different schedule. And I know that's kind of it's a difficult, very difficult process to do, but it is an individual decision for each organization, but it's some area that you may see some improvement in your overtime.
Can you say what percentage of the fire departments do the 28 versus
We
24?
had, of the 15 organizations, we had 9 that have the 28-day schedule. So a considerable number of them do that.
Okay.
The 14-day schedule was not commonly used.
Thank you.
Car allowance, we're seeing car allowance being provided for as low down in an organization as a manager level, and we see rates as much as $150 to $600 a month. And so in the future, as you're hiring your manager and executive level positions, you may want to consider car allowance as one of the benefits of that compensation package. We're also seeing for employees in general a trend to move towards employer contributions on 457 deferred comp. Not a lot, smaller amounts, but kind of an indication to the employee that you're interested in providing them some support in a 457 deferred comp. Finally, you'll see in your notebook there's salary data on elected officials. We've seen considerably higher salaries for mayor, vice mayor, and council members, and you can see that data in your notebook. We're also seeing the provision of retirement as a common option to council members. So it's another area that you're not matching up with market well.
Like,
Go ahead.
the car allowance, if you give somebody a car allowance of $200 a month, $300 a month, and they predominantly use a car at the city, obviously they would be not issued a city vehicle and they would use their own
It's one or the other.
vehicle. How does the mileage then work on that? Is that all rolled into the car allowance such that?
Yes, they don't get a mileage reimbursement. They receive a car and,
Because for some folks, that could turn into a real burden, not a benefit.
well,
I would think.
I think that's why most organizations try to do a car allowance versus a car, because there are also tax implications for a provision of a car. You have to calculate that in as part of your income, your benefit.
Not if they're coming to work in their own car first, though.
Oh, no. No. But if you provide someone with a car, then there are tax implications on that. It's simpler to do a car allowance. Final steps, implementation of the proposed pay structures. We're recommending that they be put in place June 29th. Thank you. There needs to be a strong employee communication component that lets employees know what it means to them. And in fact, based on the feedback we received from you tonight, we'd like for that communication to begin as early as tomorrow in meetings with department directors and helping them understand the system.
I got distracted. Repeat, what was the communication you wanted to have? So I was distracted by the
It's an interesting piece
very
of...
small document here.
Very small.
You were saying you wanted what communication to begin
Employee
tomorrow?
communications need to be
Magnifying
implemented fairly quickly now that data is being released, so that we're providing equal distribution of the data and not allowing it just to trickle out. So there needs to be a strong employee communication plan. There needs to be implementation information to them about the salary adjustments. You'll see what you've just been given is a breakdown of what we're recommending for implementation adjustments. We certainly want everyone who is below the entry of their proposed range to come up to the minimum of their proposed range. And there's about 64 employees. I'll read it out to you. It's hard to read. There's about 64 employees whose current pay is below their proposed range. And that would cost about $173,000 or so. That's the breakdown there. Then once an employee is, if their current pay is already in the proposed range, they need to be placed on the closest step to their current rate of pay. And so about 429 employees will have some small increase that will place them on a step within the proposed range, and that's costs about $295,000, a little less than $300,000. And then there are some select, about 24 or so, positions in the non-exempt employees only. This is non-exempt in both police, fire, and the non-exempt structure, whose pay is clustered, and we're recommending that they receive some additional adjustments, and they're fairly small, to kind of spread them out so that employees with similar time and position or different time and position are spread out a little bit so they're not clumped together. Okay. And so those adjustments are about $30,000. So that's not a lot, but it's enough just to kind of spread people out a little bit more. So those are our recommendations for implementation. We're suggesting also that HR take the responsibility of evaluating the benefits that we have recommended consideration for. And then we're preparing some updates to the annual system maintenance. Some of the policy changes include looking at how they establish hiring rates for employees, looking at the experience and skills and background that an employee brings to a job as a new hire and as an employee who has been promoted, because often employees move up at just a 5% increase and they don't get the benefit of being evaluated about how much experience and background they bring to the job. So some policy changes like that will help even out the competition, so that when you bring someone in from the outside, you're not bringing them in at a rate that the internal candidate who has similar skills and background does not have the opportunity to be hired at a similar rate of pay. So those changes are being recommended, as well as an opportunity for a lump sum payment in performance for those who are maxed out, so that there is an incentive for an employee who has been here for a considerable amount of time to continue to perform highly and get that not in their base pay, but as a lump sum merit increase. So with that, that's my presentation.
One of the questions that one of the statements that you just made has always been a cause for confusion, and that has to do with bringing someone in at making more money than someone that you already have there. You may have had to do that to get them in the door. I don't know how. I mean, that's a tough one to fix, because it's like you're constantly adjusting everyone's pay every time you bring someone in, versus just trying to catch it all up at the end of the year. So
That's a very good point, and part of the review process for a hiring offer to an outside candidate should be a review of their background and experience and the impact of that proposed salary on the current incumbents,
Excellent.
so that you're not having to do adjustments unless there's solid market data that indicates that individual position has moved significantly since your last
right, then it would require you to evaluate everyone that's sitting in that grade. So not just in that one department where
Right.
that person's going in, but everyone that's sitting in that grade.
But you really should evaluate the current incumbents and know what impact it's going to have on your employees. And there may be some employees that you cannot attract because you don't want to upset the internal equity and pay that you already have.
It's true. It's true.
A lot of questions, I'm sure. Do you want to ask them now, or you want the staff to respond?
I think the staff ought to
Yeah,
respond.
I think so.
Sorry?
I would like, when staff responds to the point about the vacation accruals and the starting vacation, would like to hear more about the fiscal impact of that, especially as we're talking about remaining competitive. There's some of those things that we can do that don't have short-term fiscal implications to us, but rather have a little bit longer term when maybe the economics are a little better, that we ought to be thinking through seriously, that 96-hour recommendation and that 320 proposed and that sort of thing. We ought to maybe think through some of those. So I'd like to hear during that time period, if we're talking accruals, kind of how many folks are at that point, when would we expect them to cash in on it, some of those kind of horizon type questions of folks that would be up against that ceiling. I don't want to say I wouldn't want to make a decision if everybody was going to cash in 320 hours next year, but I just, when you're coming back to us, I'd like to hear that.
When do you think you can come back to us?
I think it depends on the priority. This could be our research for 2007, 2008, 2009, bring it back with the next year's budget recommendations, unless there's any ones that are a super priority that you would like to hear responses back immediately. Certainly we can put those at the top of the list and research those immediately. Yellow papers back on each one, the recommendations.
So,
What would you like?
so this budget is going to be done in early July. You're talking about being ready for that budget. Is that what you just said?
I'm talking about the next fiscal
Oh,
year.
that's,
Putting
yeah,
that
you
into
said
works.
7, 8, okay, 7, that's the next one. All right, okay. The one thing about the elected officials retirement program, that gets more expensive as you delay.
It does.
That,
At any
if we're going
point
to
in time.
discuss that, we need to discuss, because it's, I don't know, what, does it become more expensive every year or every 6 months or what?
Actually, what they'll do, if we want to research that again, they'll do a new actuarial study and determine the current council at that time of what it would cost to implement it, and that's what the city's portion is to pay to implement. That's something that we strongly recommend that the city do for you all. That's what other cities do for council members, and it's a great program. So previously, we had a citizens committee look at that back in April of 2006. They recommended that every 2 years we form a citizens committee and to research your all salaries and benefits. You saw from Ruth Ann's information, your salaries are very low.
The second lowest
Embarrassingly so.
in every category.
Yes,
Without
absolutely.
retirement.
Right,
We're the only ones without retirement.
yes.
Yeah, it's a great job, folks. Really. And
But,
this is why no one wants to join us. Last time we had 3 billets and we had 3 people compete. We need to make these jobs desirable.
We can certainly do that any direction you request. We can have another citizens committee to evaluate that. Tell me if I'm wrong, Rorik. I think that that's decisions you guys can make based on the recommendations from the consultant and the facts that they've presented to you, not on salary, but on retirement. Correct?
I don't think we need that citizens
So,
committee.
Mayor, I just want to question the process, because it just seems like, I don't know how we start focusing in on some of the concerns that you had. If we try to do it as a full body, or do you go back to those people that were on the original committee and ask them, will they make recommendations back to the full body, or exactly how that is done?
And several of the recommendations, we can tell you now that we probably would not recommend. One would be the family dental. Dean can explain to you why. The 3 visits for the EAP, ours goes directly into our healthcare provider. Before it didn't, and we had 9 visits. We saved $10,000. Yes, by changing plans, and it's very, very small usage. So we can give you feedback on those things immediately. Those that require more research, really your priority is our priority, so.
I guess my question is, should we do it as a body of 7, or do we get our council members to volunteer and those maybe 2 or 3 of those folks make recommendations back to us? You know, we would do this, or we wouldn't do that, or this is how we stack up against the cities, or whatever.
We could certainly do the research and then involve small
So I was
teams
just-
if you'd like.
Yeah, I was questioning the process.
Staff, just let staff do the research.
We can do that too.
But we don't want to end up doing the debate up here. I'd like to know what people would really want to do without each one of us having to go through it.
Are you referring to all the recommendations?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's too much. And a lot of folks don't understand how it works anyway, so, you know, some of us would be at a disadvantage.
I think the deferred comp would be very well received in the city. I think that now's not the right time, so that's one that has to wait till the next budget year, I would think. That's something that our employees are very interested in, is to have the city contribute to a deferred compensation plan. It's something we've looked into, but there is a cost, and now would not be the time to bring that forward.
But you had a whole list of things, so that's what I was referring to, is the process for that whole list.
How about if we give you an update on the half of them, the ones that we already know information on, and then give you a proposal plan of action for the others? Would that work?
That sounds
That
good.
sounds good.
Would that solve the problem? I mean,
Yeah.
because, like I said, we would, rather than us debating over each one.
And one of the recommendations could be to form a committee.
Yes, that's
Okay.
what I was kind of looking for, if that's part of the process.
We need to move. Can you make it during the meeting?
Can I make it real fast?
No, thank you. But during communications. Okay, just stand there, please. Where are we on the next meeting here as far as people outside?
Mayor, from what I could tell, there are about 10 to 20 folks sitting out there, standing out there waiting.
So I guess we should go to the regular meeting?
I don't know which subjects they're here for, but they're all waiting.
I wonder.
But we do have some
only one
communications
subject.
also.
Pardon me?
We also have communications in addition to the.
That's right, we do. And you'll be citizen comments, non-agenda, okay?
One thing we'd like to hear from you, though, is if there's any objection to this being the implementation plan that Waters has recommended being included in the budget process. We don't plan to come back to you with another co-act. It would just, the implementation steps that she recommended in the dollars would just flow with the budget. So unless we hear anything differently, we'll proceed.
Proceed. Thank you very much. Very thorough study. Mark, can I ask you, or maybe I should ask Brian, can we do yours next week, or do we need to do it after the meeting? Is there a time constraint?
No, sir, no time constraint.
Can we do it next week? Because after the baseball meeting, I don't think we're going to want to listen to too much else. Yeah, I think
I guess you know where your priorities are.
I think that's going to be a very important subject. So that should end the day. You agree?
I agree.
Okay. All right. Okay, meeting's adjourned, and we'll meet at, why don't we 6:10 to let people come in and depart? Okay, 6:10.